Hey, how's it going everyone? It's Matt Orford here. Are you using or looking to use Azure Resource Manager templates, but you want a controlled way in which to store those securely and also still make them available to end users within your organization? If so, you should stay with me and let's go and check out Azure Template Specs. So what problem is being solved by Azure Template Specs? Well, a template spec is an area in Azure where you can create a template spec and then have an Azure Resource Manager template inside of that template spec. From there, you can use the standard Azure RBAC to provide other users in your organization access to the template spec. So they don't need to know about ARM templates or how to deploy from an ARM template or getting access to the JSON file. They just need to be able to open up the portal or PowerShell or AZCLI and go in, find the template spec, and then click a button that says deploy. And they will get prompted for the parameters and whatever's required to go and deploy that template. The template specs also provide versioning, so you as the creator or the maintainer of the ARM templates can still release those into a template spec ready for consumption, but you can put a version on it so the end users will know to start using the newest version, or if they need to roll back for some reason, they can go and select an old version to deploy from. Now you might be thinking that this sounds like it could be solved by using a version control system like Git. Now these two things kind of go hand in hand, so you can absolutely still use Git or a source control for the Azure Resource Manager templates. So the idea is that the creator of the templates or the people who maintain it can still go and do that. They can do Git commits and store it in a source control, but then you might have a CICD pipeline that validates the JSON template, make sure it's all in the right structure and it's validated for the ARM spec, and then you could release it from there into a template spec. So instead of the users who are deploying from the template needing to have access to the JSON file, and if it's linked templates, then they need access to the linked templates themselves as well. They don't need to worry about any of that because you can release this straight to the template spec and they can consume it from there. Let's jump into the demo and we'll check it out. I'll show you how to do it through the portal and then we'll have a look at some PowerShell using both a standard template just with one template file, and we'll take a quick look at linked templates as well. Okay, so let's start off in the Azure portal here and then we'll dive into PowerShell in a few moments. So in the search at the top here, I'm going to search for template, and what we want are these template specs here. Now, notice at the time of recording, which is early February 2021, these are currently in preview, but it is a public preview, so you should have access to these in your portal as well. We've got options at the top there for importing a template and for creating a template spec. Now, if you wanted to import a template, you can do that and it will ask you for the Azure Resource Manager template file, so the JSON file to go and import. But I'm going to go through the full wizard of creating a template spec here. So the first thing we need to do is provide a name for the spec itself. So this is going to be vnet-template because this is going to deploy a VNet for me. And in the resource group, I'm going to create a new one and call it RG Template Specs. Now this is the name of the resource group where your template specs will be located. It is not the resource group where the actual resources that are going to be deployed will land. You define that when you're going to deploy from the template spec. I'll leave the location there as East US, that's okay. And for the description, you can put something in here. So it might be something like template used to provision standard VNet with 2 subnets, just as an example. Now, as we scroll down, there's some settings down here for specifying the first version of this template spec. So you must put a version number in, and this can really be anything that you want. It's an arbitrary number that can match whatever you want to do. So for example, I'm going to just put 0.1 in there. And for the change notes, this is optional, but let's do something like initial version. Feels like a commit with initial commit, doesn't it? If we go to edit template on the next page, this is where we can paste in, or if you wanted to, not that you probably would, but you could obviously type out an entire Resource Manager template here. So what I've got in another tab at the top, and I'll link to this in the YouTube clip notes as well, is this is the Azure Quick Start Templates repository on GitHub, where there's a heap of ARM templates here for you to go and use and start to consume. So I'm looking at one here, which is just called 101-vnet-2-subnets. So I'm just going to go down here and get the raw of this. So I can copy all of that into my clipboard and then come back into the portal, and I'm going to replace that and paste in all of that information. So that gets my template spec ready. As per all of the Azure resources, you can set some tags here if you want, but I don't want to, so I'm going to jump to review and create and then spin that up. So a couple of moments later, the template spec gets created and you can see we've got one result there now. So on the ellipsis over here, we do have some options to be able to view it, edit it, delete it, or deploy from it as well. Let's jump into view and we'll get some more information about the template spec itself. So at the top there, you'll see we get those same options that we just had to deploy from this template spec or create a new version, or we can edit the description of it. We get some information there in the main pane about the actual resource itself. And then down towards the bottom here, there's a section for the version and also a link to the main template. If we click on the main template there, this will actually show the JSON of the ARM template that this template spec is going to use. And there's nothing in here at the moment, but if I go back under artifacts down the bottom there, we'll check that out when we get into link templates in a couple of minutes. So now that I've created this template spec, if I wanted to give someone else in the organization access to deploy from it, so this is someone who doesn't need to know about ARM templates and what goes on under the hood, we can just simply go into the normal access control IAM section of Azure and just provide them with a role assignment in here and just give them read access into this template spec. Giving them read access will be enough for them to come in here, find the template spec and be able to do a deployment from it. They can't necessarily edit or change the template spec, but they can consume it from an end user point of view for someone that might spin up environments or spin up resources. Over on the left here, we've got versions. So at the moment, we've only got that initial version of 0.1, but if you wanted to, you can come in here to create a new version. So let's create a new version at the top there. And because I've only got one version at the moment, it is basing this new version off that only one that I've got, 0.1. So let's go in here and I'll make a 0.2. And for the change notes, I'm going to say remove second subnet from template. And if I go into next to edit the template, I'll just scroll down a little bit here. This will be a bit finicky in this UI, but if I scroll down, let's pull out that information for the subnet 2. And if we scroll down a bit more to the resources, let's take out this second subnet from the template. And from there, I can go next to edit the tags if I wanted to, and straight into review and save. So that looks good for version 0.2. I'm going to give that a save. Now that I've got two versions in the template spec here, you can see that I've got the description of each version. And if I was to create another version now, I won't actually go through this, but I can choose which version I want to base this new version off. So if you wanted to make a modification now still off 0.1, you can go ahead and do that from here. Now, if you want to deploy a specific version, you'd need to do that from this pane. So you just click on the ellipsis for the version and there's an option here to deploy. But most often I'd assume that people are going to be deploying the latest version. So if we go back to the overview tab, let's imagine we were a user now with just read access into this template spec. I could come into here, go to the overview tab, and then I can come up to deploy here to deploy from this template spec. So by default, this is going to use the latest version there, which is 0.2. And I need to select the parameters now. So that subscription, let's put it in a new resource group just called rg-vnet will do. And we'll leave it as east-US, and actually all those settings are fine. And you'll notice there it's only got one subnet because I pulled the second subnet out of this version of the template. So if I go to review and create, I get the standard validation and I have to accept the Azure Marketplace terms, which is pretty standard for deploying any resource. And you can see a summary of what's going to be deployed from here. So let's go create to actually spin that up. And while that's happening across in the background, let's go and check out some stuff inside of PowerShell. So I've got my PowerShell console here. This is just PowerShell 7. I've got the AZ module installed and I've logged into my Azure subscription already. Now, what I've got here that I want to show you, if I do a get content on my C drive templates and storage account.json or storage ACC, this is a really standard template that is just going to spin up a storage account. So we've got one parameter to specify the storage account type, and then it's going to go and deploy a storage account for me. So I've got that JSON file there ready. So let's do a get-az template spec. Now, if you are following along with this, you will need version 5 or later of the AZ PowerShell module as well, which supports template specs. So this should retrieve us just the one template spec that we've got. There we go. So we've got our VNet template. So using PowerShell, I can create a new template spec, and I can use the template file that I've got locally, the JSON file, rather than having to go and, like I did in the portal where I copied and pasted in the information. So we can do that by running new AZ template spec. Now we need to provide a name. So for this one, I'll call it storage spec. And for the version, let's do this one as a 1.0. The resource group name, I'm going to put that in the same resource group as my other template, which is RG Template Specs. The location is East US. And then the parameter that I'm looking for is, we can use a template JSON. So if you had an actual JSON constructed like in a variable in PowerShell, you could pass that directly through. But I'm going to use the template file here and then specify the path to C, templates, and my storage account. So let's run that and we'll see what happens. All right, that's looking good there. So let's up arrow to run the get AZ template spec again. And there we go. We've got our second template spec, which is the storage spec. So that's uploaded the JSON template, created a new template spec, versioned it as 1.0, and now that's ready to go and be consumed. So that process that we just went through there, you could integrate that into a CICD pipeline, right? So as the creator of ARM templates, if that was, me or you, for example, we could still use Git version control. We can create the ARM template and we can use a Git repository for our versioning of the ARM template. And then we could have a pipeline maybe that does some verification on the ARM template to make sure that it's all specified correctly. And then it does a deployment to a template spec ready to be consumed by someone else in your organization or your company or one of your customers. So now that we've gone and deployed that new storage account template spec, doing a deployment from PowerShell is pretty stock standard if you've ever done any deployments using the new AZ Resource Group deployment commandlet before. So for example, let's spin up a new AZ Resource Group, and I'll give this one a name of RG-storage account, and the location will drop this one in East US so that everything's there. Now, when you want to deploy from a template spec, we need to go and get the ID of the specific version of the template spec that we want to use. We can't specify just the root object template spec itself. We have to be very specific about the version at this point in time. So if we run get AZ template spec again, and let's get the resource group name, which was RG-template specs, and the name, I think I called it storage spec. And the version we had as 1.0. Just make sure that returns a result there, and it does, which is great. So we've got an ID at the top there, but that's not enough for the new AZ Resource Group deployment commandlet. So we actually have to dive in. You can see there's a property there called versions. So if I'm just going to up arrow, and I'm going to go back to the start of that command and put a bracket there, and I'm going to go to the end and close that off, and then have a look at the versions property. Under here, we can see that this is specific for version 1.0. If I had multiple versions, I'd see those here, and I can get the ID property, and you'll notice towards the end there that it's actually got /versions/1.0. So it's very specific about the version of the template spec. So what I'm going to do is do a .id after that, and I'm going to press my home button to go back to the start, and I'll put that in a variable just called $ID. From there, to do a deployment of that template spec, all we need to do now is call the standard new AZ Resource Group deployment. And there's a parameter here now called template. Where is it? There we go, template spec ID. So we can just pass the ID that we just captured into that. And the resource group name was RG-storage ACC. And I'll kick that off, and that's all there is to it. So if you've used that commandlet before to deploy ARM templates, it'll be very familiar. It's just that now we're passing in the ID of a template spec rather than the actual ARM template itself, the JSON file. So we can see that's gone and deployed okay. If I do a get AZ storage account on that and look in the resource group of RG-storage ACC, then we'll see that that's pulled back the new storage account that I just deployed. And notice here that the SKU name is standard LRS, which was one of the default values of the only parameter. So same as before, if I just up arrow back to the new AZ resource group deployment, like you normally would with a JSON file, you can actually just pass through the parameters here as well. So for example, if I wanted to say the storage account type should actually be a standard, let's go with standard GRS. That is just going to pass that parameter straight through into the template spec, and it's going to update the deployment that I've already deployed, and it'll change the storage account from being standard LRS to standard GRS. So again, using those parameters within the templates is exactly the same as what we've been doing all along, really. Now, the last thing I want to show quickly are linked templates. So with linked templates in Azure Resource Manager, you can create a template that has a reference to another Resource Manager template. So you might do this to be very modular with your deployments, and you can kind of link them all together. Now, linked templates, historically or typically, you have to point to a URI, and that's got to be an endpoint that the Azure Resource Manager engine can go and hit. So that's got to be something like a public endpoint, like a GitHub repository, or maybe you can store your files in Azure Storage and use a SAS token. But all of that starts to get a little bit involved. So when working with template specs themselves, there's some pretty nice features here with working with linked templates that makes that all a little bit nicer. So let's take a look. Let me clear the screen there, and I want to change directory into templates. And let's have a look in here. So in the middle there, we've got the storage account that I just used. So let's ignore that moving forward. So the one that I've got there that I want to work with now is this web-deploy.json. So let's have a look at that with get content, and we'll take a look at web deploy. Now, the only thing that I really want to point out here, it is a standard ARM template, but I'm not going to go through all of the syntax. But down the bottom here, if I scroll up, we do have this Microsoft.resources/deployments, which is a typical way of creating a new deployment or a linked deployment from within a template. But the thing here is, if you look at the template link, we've got this relative path. So I can tell the template spec where my other resource manager templates are that I'm trying to link in from here. And when I go and create a new template spec, it will upload those for me and pull them into the template spec and store them all together. So the relative path that we're looking at here is artifacts, which is a folder that I've got inside of my current directory, /linked storage template or linked STG template. Now that relative path, as kind of said by the property name of relative, is relative to where this template is that we're working with. So this kind of root template that is then linking off to others, you need to specify the paths that are relative to where that template is. So if that linked storage template was just in the same folder, then I would just remove the artifacts folder that I've got there, and it's going to work. So let's go ahead and create a new template spec with a linked template. So I'm going to run new-az template spec. And for the name of this one, let's call it web service. Version, we'll give it a version of 1.0, and the resource group name has been the same as before, which is our template specs. Location will be East US still, and for the template file, this time I can just specify the web-deploy.json. So because of that linking inside of it, I don't need to tell it anything about the storage template. So let's go and give that a run. And there we go, that's gone and created the template spec for me. So if I now do a get AZ template spec, we should see our 3 template specs. The first one that we created in the portal, which was the VNet template. The second one, which was a basic one in PowerShell, which was the storage spec. And the third one that we just created, which was the web service. So let's take a closer look quickly in PowerShell at that link template that we just created. So I'll run get AZ template spec again, and let's specify the web service. And we have to put a resource group name here at the moment for template specs. So when I look at that there, I'm not seeing anything immediately that's telling me that this has got linked templates or artifacts on it as well. But if I press the up arrow, and again, like before, I'm just going to close that in parentheses. If we take a look at the versions, inside of here, you can see that there's a property named artifacts. And the only artifact on this one is artifacts/linked STG template, which is the link template that we were referencing from the web template. So if I up arrow again, and let's take a look at that artifacts property, this will actually show the JSON for that linked storage account. So we can see the path to it, and we can see the actual raw template JSON that we've got there. So just lastly, to wrap up, let me jump back over to the Azure portal, and I want to go back into template specs. And we can see here that we've got our web service at the top. So let me go into the web service template spec. And like I said before, I did tell you that I'd come and show you. If we scroll down here, we can see that we've got the main template, which is just the web service itself. And if I scroll down, you'll see here that it's still got the relative path to the artifacts/linked STG template. And if we close that off, we can now see in the UI here that we've got some artifacts, or we've got one, and what the relative path is. And if I click on that, I can see the raw JSON for that linked template as well. One thing that's worth calling out here though, is if I close that and have a look at the versions, if I wanted to create a new version of this linked template, and I try and do that from the portal here, it'll let me create the new version, but let me just put in 1.1 there so I can get to the template. In the template section here, I only see that root template or the main template that we've got for the web service itself. I don't get access to the linked template anywhere here for the storage account. So if you needed to make changes to any of your linked templates, you'd be best off doing that, outside of this and inside some source control. And I think that's typically how this will be used anyway. I don't think the portal editor is going to be very commonly used myself. So just do be aware of that with the linked templates. Awesome. That's all I got for you for now. I hope you really enjoyed that. I hope you got something out of it. Let me know in the comments below. Let me know on Twitter. My handle there is @MattOrford. I'd love to hear from you. Hopefully this was helpful, and I'll see you next time.